You know that feeling when the bottom drops out of your stomach? That cold, sickening rush when you realize the person you loved just made you the punchline of their cruelest joke. Maeve stood in a room of 400 people, listening to the man she was supposed to marry announce his engagement to someone else. She was supposed to break. She was supposed to cry. But then, the most dangerous man in the city walked up, took her hand, and changed the punchline entirely. The ballroom of the St. Regis smelled of expensive orchids and old money, a cloying combination that had been turning Maeve's stomach for the better part of an hour. She stood near a marble pillar, a flute of untouched champagne warming in her grip, her knuckles white. She wasn't supposed to be here, or rather, she was supposed to be the guest of honor. Just 3 weeks ago, Liam Preston had sat across from her at their kitchen table, his eyes avoiding hers as he dismantled 3 years of their lives. "It's the pressure, Maeve," he had said, his voice dripping with that manufactured sincerity he used in boardrooms. "My family needs me to step up. We're just on different paths. You're brilliant, but you don't fit into the Preston world." Not really. He had asked for the ring back. She gave it to him without a tear. She had pride. She had a spine, but she didn't have the luxury of skipping tonight's charity gala. Her accounting firm managed the foundation hosting the event, and her boss had made her attendance mandatory. "Hold your head high, Gallagher," he had told her. "Let them see you bleed, and they'll feast." So Maeve wore a sleek, navy blue gown she had bought with her own money. She wore her spine steel straight. She smiled at the right people and deflected the thinly veiled, pitying glances from the socialites who already knew the gossip. She thought she had survived the worst of it. Then, the microphone whined with a sharp squawk of feedback. The low hum of polite chatter died down as Liam stepped up to the podium. He looked sickeningly handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his blonde hair perfectly swept back. He tapped the microphone, flashing that 100-watt smile that used to make Maeve's heart skip. Now, it just made her feel deeply, profoundly tired. "Thank you, everyone. Thank you," Liam's voice echoed over the PA system. "It's an honor to host the annual Preston Foundation Gala. We've raised a record amount for pediatric research tonight." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Maeve took a sip of the warm champagne. It tasted like ash. "But tonight is special for another reason," Liam continued, his tone dropping an octave, slipping into something intimate. Too intimate for a room of 400 people. "Many of you know that the last few months have been a period of transition for me." Maeve froze. The glass in her hand felt suddenly heavy. The people standing nearest to her subtly shifted their weight, their eyes darting sideways to gauge her reaction. "I've had to make hard choices about my future," Liam said, leaning into the microphone. "About the kind of legacy the Preston family requires. And sometimes you have to realize that what you thought was right was just a placeholder for what is perfect." A cold sweat broke out on the back of Maeve's neck. "Don't do this," she thought, her internal voice a desperate, ragged whisper. "Don't do this here." I realized I needed a partner who inherently understands the demands of our world. Someone with grace, with pedigree, and with a heart as beautiful as her face. Liam extended his hand toward the front row. "Chloe, darling, come up here." Chloe Danvers, the daughter of a real estate mogul, a girl whose entire personality was built around designer bags and a trust fund. She stepped onto the stage, feigning a blushing surprise, her silk dress clinging to her lithe frame. Liam took her hand. "Tonight, I'm not just asking you to open your wallets for a good cause. Asking you to raise a glass to my future. Chloe has agreed to do me the profound honor of becoming my wife." The room erupted. Cheers, clapping, the popping of flash photography from the society pages. Maeve stood, paralyzed. The breath had been knocked out of her lungs. It wasn't just that he was engaged 3 weeks after ending a 3-year relationship. It was the speech. A placeholder for what is perfect. He had publicly, deliberately, reduced her to a temporary convenience. He had stood on a stage and told Boston's elite that she wasn't good enough. The applause felt physical, like slaps against her skin. She saw Chloe turn and scan the crowd, her eyes locking onto Maeve's for a split second. A tiny, triumphant smirk curled the corner of Chloe's glossed lips. Maeve didn't run. Running was what they wanted, but the air in the room had turned to lead. She placed her champagne glass carefully on a passing waiter's tray. Her hands were shaking so badly, the crystal clinked violently against the silver platter. She needed air. She needed to not be in a room where 400 people were celebrating her erasure. Maeve began the long, agonizing walk toward the velvet-draped exits. Every step felt like walking through deep water. The crowd was parting, but not out of respect, out of a morbid desire to watch the wreckage float by. She heard the whispers. Oh God, she actually showed up? Did you hear what he said? Placeholder. Brutal. Well, what did she expect? She's an accountant from Southie. Chloe is a Danvers. She kept her chin up, her eyes fixed on the heavy oak doors at the end of the corridor. Just 50 feet. 40 feet. Maeve! The voice caught her just as she reached the coat check. She stopped, closing her eyes for a fractured second, praying for patience she didn't possess. She turned around. Liam was jogging slightly down the hall, adjusting his cuffs, looking flush with victory. Chloe was trailing just behind him, a massive, obnoxious diamond catching the hallway sconce light. I saw you slipping out, Liam said, stopping a few feet away. His expression was a masterclass in faux concern. I wanted to make sure you were okay. I know this might be a little jarring. Maeve looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the weak slope of his shoulders, the vanity in his eyes. How had she spent 3 years loving this empty suit? I'm fine, Liam, she said, her voice shockingly steady. Congratulations on the engagement. It was a very theatrical announcement. Chloe looped her arm through Liam's, leaning her head against his shoulder. Oh, don't be bitter, Maeve. Liam just wanted to share our happiness. I told him we should have warned you. But you know how spontaneous he is. Spontaneous. Liam scheduled his haircuts a year in advance. This was calculated, a public execution of Maeve's reputation to cement Chloe's status. I'm not bitter, Chloe, Maeve said, though the acid in her stomach was burning her throat. I'm just leaving. Look, Maeve. Liam stepped forward, dropping his voice into a patronizing register. You're a smart girl. You're good with numbers. You had to know the math on us didn't add up long term. My parents needed me to marry someone. Well, someone in our sphere. No hard feelings? He actually held out his hand. He wanted absolution. He wanted to humiliate her, break her, and then have her shake his hand and tell him it was okay. Maeve stared at his manicured fingers. The urge to spit in his face was overwhelming, but she knew how that would play. Crazy, jealous ex. Before she could form a reply, the atmosphere in the hallway changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a drop in pressure. The few guests lingering near the coat check suddenly fell dead silent, stepping back against the walls, melting into the shadows. The valet attendant dropped his gaze to the floor. Footsteps echoed on the marble. Heavy, unhurried, rhythmic. Maeve turned her head. Declan Walsh was walking down the corridor. He didn't look like the monsters in the stories. He didn't have a scarred face or wear flashy, mob-wife-approved jewelry. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Liam's car. His dark hair was neatly styled, with a few silver threads at the temples. But it was his eyes. pale, glacial grey, that held the violence. They were the eyes of a man who looked at the world and saw only leverage and liabilities. The Walsh family owned the shipping yards. They owned the unions. According to the federal indictments that never quite seemed to stick, they owned half the judges in the state. Declan was the head of the snake. He was 34, notoriously private, and violently protective of his empire. He shouldn't even be here. The Prestons considered themselves high society. The Walshes were underworld kings. They didn't mix, yet here he was, walking directly toward them. Liam's hand dropped to his side. The color drained from his perfectly tanned face. Even Chloe seemed to shrink, her socialite bravado vaporizing in the presence of actual, terrifying power. Maeve held her breath as Declan approached. She knew of him, of course. She had audited a shell company 2 years ago that, upon deeper inspection, traced back to a Walsh holding group. She had quietly flagged it to her boss, who had turned pale and deleted the file. She had met Declan once, briefly, in a sterile boardroom where he had looked at her with those cold eyes, nodded once, and left. That was it. Declan didn't stop to greet Liam. He didn't even look at him. He stopped directly in front of Maeve. Up close, he smelled of cedarwood, rain, and something sharp, like gun oil. He was easily a head taller than her, broad-shouldered and imposing, blocking out the light from the chandeliers. He looked down at her. The harsh, terrifying lines of his face softened, just a fraction. "You look tired, Maeve," Declan said. His voice was a low rumble, a quiet vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of her bones. Maeve blinked, completely derailed. It's been a long night, Mr. Walsh." "Declan," he corrected smoothly. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He commanded the space simply by occupying it. He finally turned his head, his pale eyes sliding over to Liam and Chloe. He looked at them the way a scientist looks at a particularly uninteresting insect. "Preston," Declan said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of existence, and barely that. "Walsh," Liam managed, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to puff his chest out. "I didn't realize you were on the guest list. I own the building, Liam. I don't need a list," Declan replied, his tone conversational, yet entirely lethal. He looked back at Maeve. "Are you ready to leave?" Maeve stared at Declan. Her mind raced, trying to find the angle, trying to understand the play. Men like Declan Walsh didn't do favors. They didn't rescue damsels. They made transactions. But right now, standing in front of her ex-fiancé and the woman who had just helped humiliate her on a public stage, Declan was offering her a door. More than a door. He was offering her a shield. "Yes," Maeve said, her voice finding its strength. "I'm quite ready to leave." Liam's face flushed red. His ego, battered by Declan's casual dismissal, flared up dangerously. He was used to being the biggest fish in the Preston Foundation pond. He forgot, for a fatal second, that Declan swam in the ocean. "Hold on a second," Liam said, stepping forward. "We were in the middle of a conversation, Walsh. Maeve and I have history. She was just congratulating us." Declan slowly turned his entire body to face Liam. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air seemed to turn frigid. Declan didn't glare. He just stared, unblinking, letting the silence stretch until Liam shifted uncomfortably on his feet, the bravado leaking out of him. "You were speaking to her," Declan corrected quietly. "She was enduring you. There is a difference." Chloe gasped softly, offended, clutching Liam's arm. "Excuse me, Mr. Walsh, but there's no need to be rude. Liam was just checking on her. It's not our fault she couldn't keep up with our circles. We're just trying to be civil." Declan's gaze flicked to Chloe. "Civil? Like announcing an engagement in front of 400 people to a woman you left 21 days ago. Your definition of civility is as cheap as your jewelry, Miss Danvers." Chloe's jaw dropped, her hand flying to cover her diamond, genuinely stung. Liam took a step forward, anger finally overriding his survival instinct. "Watch how you speak to my fiancé, Walsh. I don't care who your family is, you don't disrespect her. And you have no business interfering with Maeve. She's nothing to you." Maeve felt a flush of humiliation return. Nothing. He was right. She was a pawn in whatever power play this was. Declan didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. "Nothing to me," Declan murmured. He pulled his hand out. Between his long, calloused fingers, he held a ring. It wasn't a modern, flashy diamond like Chloe's. It was an antique, a massive, deep-water emerald, flanked by brilliant cut diamonds set in heavy, tarnished platinum. It was a ring that looked like it had been pulled from a sunken galleon or stripped from the finger of European royalty a century ago. It reeked of blood, history, and immeasurable wealth. Declan reached out and took Maeve's left hand. His touch was surprisingly warm. His fingers were rough, brushing against her smooth skin. Maeve froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up into his pale eyes, a silent question screaming in her head. "What are you doing?" Declan held her gaze. The warning was there, subtle but undeniable. "Follow my lead." With a smooth, deliberate motion, Declan slid the heavy emerald onto her ring finger. It fit perfectly. The cold metal settled against her skin, heavy as an anchor. Liam stopped breathing. Chloe stared, her eyes wide, the fake sympathy entirely gone, replaced by naked, ugly shock. Declan kept Maeve's hand in his, lacing his fingers through hers. He turned his head slightly, just enough to look down his nose at Liam. "You seem confused, Preston," Declan said, his voice carrying down the dead silent hallway. "You called her a placeholder. You called her a bad fit for your trivial little world." Declan stepped closer to Liam. The physical intimidation was absolute. Liam stumbled back a half step. "She wasn't a bad fit, Liam. She was slumming it. And she's not a placeholder." Declan lifted Maeve's hand, the emerald catching the light, burning a brilliant, vibrant green against the shadows. "She's my fiancé. And if you, or your vapid new bride, or anyone in your pathetic family ever speaks her name in public again, I won't buy your foundation out from under you. I will burn it to the ground with you inside it." The words weren't spoken with heat. They were spoken as a quiet, irrefutable fact. Liam's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. He looked from the ring to Declan, to Maeve. The social hierarchy he had relied on his entire life had just been violently inverted. He hadn't just dumped an accountant. He had apparently insulted the future wife of the city's apex predator. I didn't know," Liam stammered, the fear finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "Ignorance isn't an excuse," Declan said coldly. "Now get out of my sight. You're standing in my fiancé's light." Liam grabbed Chloe by the arm and practically dragged her toward the ballroom, neither of them looking back. The hallway was empty now, save for the terrified coat-check girl who was pretending to be invisible. Maeve stood frozen. Her hand was still encased in Declan's. The weight of the emerald on her finger felt incredibly heavy, a physical tether to a man who lived in the shadows. She looked up at him. The cold, lethal mask he had worn for Liam was slipping, replaced by something unreadable. "Breathe, Maeve," he said quietly. "You just—" She started, her voice shaking slightly, entirely losing her composure now that the audience was gone. "You just told the heir to the Preston fortune that we're engaged. You threatened to burn down a charity. You put a ring on my finger." "I did," Declan agreed calmly. "Why?" she demanded, yanking her hand back, though the ring stayed firmly on her finger. "I don't even know you. We met once, 2 years ago, for 10 minutes. Declan slid his hands into his pockets, looking down at her with a maddeningly calm expression. "I know exactly who you are, Maeve Gallagher," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in the ghost of a smile. "I know you're a brilliant forensic accountant. I know you drink your coffee black. I know you spent the last 3 years carrying a man who didn't deserve to breathe your air." He stepped a fraction closer, invading her space, his scent wrapping around her again. "He humiliated you in front of this city," Declan said, his voice dropping into a dark, rough cadence. "I just made you untouchable. Now the question is..." He offered his arm to her, his pale eyes locking onto hers. "Are you going to walk out of here alone, or are you going to let me take you home?" Maeve did not take his arm. She looked at the expensive wool of his suit sleeve, then up into those glacial eyes, and simply fell into step beside him. The walk through the St. Regis lobby was a blur. The news of what had happened in the hallway had already seeped under the ballroom doors. Maeve could feel the stairs tracking them like sniper lasers. Declan didn't rush. He walked with the slow, measured pace of a man who owned the concrete beneath his shoes. They stepped out into the biting October air. A sleek, matte black armored Maybach was idling at the curb. A man built like a heavy-duty refrigerator opened the back door. Declan waited for her to slide in first. The interior smelled of rich leather, expensive scotch, and the faint metallic tang of the city. As the heavy door shut, sealing them in a soundproof vault, all the adrenaline drained out of Maeve's system at once. Her hands began to shake again. She folded them in her lap, staring down at the massive emerald dragging down her ring finger. "Drink," Declan said. She looked up. He was holding out a short, crystal glass filled with an amber liquid. She took it, the rim clinking against her teeth as she took a swallow. It burned going down, a high-end whiskey that instantly warmed the ice in her veins. The car pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the Boston traffic. The neon lights of the city washed over Declan's face, throwing sharp shadows across his cheekbones. "I am an accountant, Mr. Walsh," Maeve said, her voice raspy from the liquor. "I spend my life assessing risk, calculating return on investment, and finding the hidden costs in every transaction. So, tell me, what is the hidden cost of this?" She raised her left hand, the emerald flashing in the dim light. Declan rested his elbow on the armrest, watching her with a steady, unblinking gaze. "You think I rescued you for a price? I think men like you don't do anything without a strategic objective," she countered. "You didn't humiliate Liam Preston just because you felt sorry for me. You don't know me. I told you in the hallway. I know exactly who you are." Declan leaned forward slightly. The proximity made Maeve's breath hitch, but she refused to pull back. 2 years ago, you audited a holding company named Oakhaven. You found a discrepancy. $7.2 million, routed through a series of shell corporations, neatly washed and dried. You flagged it to your managing partner. Maeve went incredibly still. "He deleted the file. He told me it was a system error. He told me to forget it if I wanted to keep my career. He deleted it because I paid him to," Declan said plainly, as if discussing the weather. "But you didn't make a mistake, Maeve. Your math was flawless. You found a leak in my ship that my own people missed. I've been keeping tabs on you ever since." Maeve stared at him, trying to reconcile the cold-blooded mobster with the man sitting across from her. "You need a forensic accountant, so you hire one. You don't put a target on their back by dragging them into a fake engagement." "I didn't fake anything," Declan said softly. "The ring belonged to my grandmother. She brought it over from Belfast, sewn into the lining of her coat. It hasn't seen the light of day in 40 years. "That doesn't answer the question, Declan." He sighed, a low, rumbling sound. "My empire is transitioning. The old ways, the docks, the cash businesses, they draw too much heat. I'm moving our capital into commercial banking and international real estate. Legitimate, insured, federally regulated money. To do that, I need to pass board approvals. I need character references. I need to look like a man who is settling down, not a man who settles scores. You need a wife, Maeve translated, the cynicism returning in full force. A respectable, clean civilian wife to sanitize your image for the Federal Banking Commission. I need a partner, Declan corrected, his voice hardening. Someone who won't flinch when the federal agents knock. Someone who can read a ledger and tell me who in my inner circle is currently bleeding me dry. Because that 7 million you found 2 years ago, it was just the beginning. Someone inside my house is stealing from me. I need someone looking at the books who isn't connected to the bloodlines. Maeve looked down at the ring. The math was laid out in front of her. Liam had dumped her because she didn't have enough social capital to elevate him. Declan was claiming her because her brain and her clean record were exactly the assets he required. It was cold. It was transactional. It was exactly what she needed to hear. She didn't want poetry. She wanted terms. If I do this, Maeve said, her voice dropping into a professional cadence. If I play the fiancé, and I find your rat in the ledgers, what's my fee? A genuine, dangerous smile curved Declan's lips. It transformed his face, making him look younger, sharper, and utterly lethal. Protection, Declan said. Total, absolute immunity from the world. You keep the ring. I buy you a partnership in any accounting firm in the state, or fund your own. And in the meantime, I make sure that Liam Preston and his new bride cross the street when they see you coming for the rest of their pathetic lives. The car rolled to a smooth stop. Maeve looked out the window. They were parked outside her modest apartment building in South Boston. The neighborhood was asleep. Declan reached across the seat. He didn't touch her hand this time. He just tapped his index finger against the edge of the emerald. Take the night, Maeve, he said quietly. If you take the ring off and leave it in your mailbox, my men will pick it up tomorrow. You'll never see me again. But if you walk into my office tomorrow morning wearing it, you are mine. We play this game to the bone. No half measures. Maeve opened the door. The cold air rushed in. She stepped out onto the curb, turning to look at him one last time. He sat in the shadows of the Maybach, an apex predator waiting for her decision. She shut the door without a word and walked up the steps to her building. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the green stone. She thought about Liam's patronizing voice. She thought about the pitying looks of the society wives. Then she thought about the cold, absolute certainty in Declan Walsh's eyes when he told the city she was untouchable. At 7 a.m., Maeve took a shower. She put on her sharpest black suit, tied her hair back into an unforgiving knot, and left the ring exactly where it was. The offices of Walsh Holdings were located on the top 3 floors of a glass and steel high-rise overlooking the Boston Harbor. It didn't look like a mafia stronghold. It looked like a Fortune 500 hedge fund. When Maeve stepped out of the elevator, she was immediately flanked by 2 men in tailored suits who looked entirely too comfortable with the heavy bulges under their jackets. They didn't ask her name. They simply nodded at her left hand and escorted her down a long corridor lined with modern art. Declan's office was a massive corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows. He was standing by the glass, looking out at the shipping containers stacked like colorful blocks miles below. He wore his trousers and a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the faded ink of a Celtic cross on his left wrist. He turned as she walked in. His eyes dropped to her hand. He saw the emerald. The tension in his broad shoulders released just a fraction, though his face remained a mask. "Coffee is on the desk," Declan said, walking toward a massive mahogany conference table, piled high with leather-bound ledgers and hard drives. "Black, just how you like it." Maeve walked over, picking up the cup. "We need to set ground rules, Declan. If I'm going to do this, I do it my way." Declan leaned against the edge of the table, crossing his arms over his chest. "I'm listening. First, I answer to you, and only you. I won't have your captains or your muscle questioning my requests for documents. If I ask for a bank statement, I get it. Unredacted. Done," he said smoothly. "Second, publicly we are engaged. Privately, we are colleagues. I won't be your arm candy, and I won't sleep in your bed." Declan's gaze dropped to her mouth for a fraction of a second before meeting her eyes again. The air in the room suddenly felt very thick. "You'll sleep in my house. The press and the feds will be watching. I have a guest wing. But I don't force women into my bed, Maeve. You have my word on that." She ignored the sudden, betraying flutter in her stomach. "Good. Then let's get to work. Show me the bleed." For the next 8 hours they didn't speak of Liam, or the gala, or the absurdity of their situation. They spoke the language of numbers. Declan was fiercely intelligent. He understood the macroeconomics of his empire perfectly, but he lacked the microscopic patience required for forensic auditing. Maeve dug in. She laid out spreadsheets across the mahogany table, cross-referencing shipping manifests from the Walsh docks with offshore bank transfers. By late afternoon, the city outside was turning amber with the setting sun. Maeve rubbed her temples, staring at a printout of a holding company based in the Cayman Islands. "Here," she said softly, tapping the paper with her pen. Declan, who had been reviewing legal briefs on the sofa, immediately stood and walked over. He stood close behind her, leaning over her shoulder to look at the document. She could feel the heat radiating off his body, the faint smell of his cedarwood cologne wrapping around her. "What am I looking at?" he asked, his voice a low rumble right next to her ear. "It's a skimming operation, but it's brilliant," Maeve said, sliding her finger across the columns. "They aren't stealing large lump sums. They're manipulating the exchange rates on your international freight invoices. Whenever a client pays in euros or sterling, the conversion rate is logged at a fraction of a percent lower than the actual market rate on that specific day. It looks like standard currency fluctuation, but the difference is being siphoned into this Cayman account." Declan leaned closer. "How much?" "A few thousand here and there. But over the volume of freight you move? In the last 18 months, they've bled nearly $12 million. Silence stretched in the room. It was a heavy, violent silence. Maeve looked up at Declan's profile. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle ticked near his ear. The cold composure was cracking, revealing the ruthless enforcer beneath. "Who has authorization to log those specific exchange rates?" Declan asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Only 3 people have the administrative passwords for the freight ledger," Maeve said, turning the paper over to show him a list she had made. "Your CFO, your head of dock operations, and your uncle, Patrick Walsh." Declan stared at the names. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. He stepped back from her, running a hand through his dark hair. "Patrick," Declan muttered, staring out the window at the harbour. "The old man is funding a retirement plan on my dime." "You can't prove it's him yet," Maeve cautioned, her professional instincts kicking in. "It could be a compromised password. It could be the CFO acting under duress." "It's Patrick," Declan said flatly. "He's been angry since I took over the family. He thinks I'm going soft by moving us into legal banking. He wants the blood and the dirt." Declan turned back to her, his pale eyes burning with a dark intensity. "You found in 8 hours what my internal auditors couldn't find in 2 years. Your internal auditors are terrified of you," Maeve pointed out. "They were looking for what you wanted them to see, not what was actually there." Declan walked slowly back to the table, stopping just inches from her. He reached out, his large hand gently catching her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. His thumb brushed lightly against her jawline. The touch was entirely unexpected, sending a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. "And you aren't terrified of me, Maeve?" he asked softly. "I'm terrified of failure," she answered, holding his gaze, refusing to blink. "You're just a client with a very specific set of problems." Declan's thumb stopped moving. He stared into her eyes for a long moment, the ghost of that dangerous smile returning. "A client, right. Come on, put the ledgers away." "Why? We have more ground to cover." "Because," Declan interrupted, dropping his hand and stepping back to grab his suit jacket from a chair. "Tonight is Sunday, and in my family on Sunday we have dinner. It's time to introduce my fiancé to the wolves." The Walsh family estate was located in a heavily wooded suburb of Milton, surrounded by wrought iron gates and stone walls. It wasn't a mobster's tacky mansion. It was a sprawling, historic stone manor that whispered of generational wealth and entrenched power. As the Maybach pulled up the long, curving driveway, Maeve felt a knot of genuine anxiety tighten in her stomach. Crunching numbers in a sterile office was one thing. Walking into a den of organized crime bosses and pretending to be the woman who had captured their leader's heart was entirely different. Declan seemed to sense her tension. Before the driver opened the door, Declan reached across the seat and placed his hand firmly over hers. "They are going to test you," Declan said, his tone entirely serious. "They view any outsider as a threat, and a civilian wife as a liability. They will try to find your breaking point." "And what do I do when they try?" Maeve asked, her voice tight. "You don't break," Declan said simply. "You remember that you are wearing my ring. In this house, that makes you royalty. Do not defer to them. Do not let them talk down to you. If they bite, you bite back harder. I will not let them harm you, but I need them to respect you." The door opened. Declan stepped out and offered his hand. Maeve took a deep breath, channeled every ounce of professional armor she possessed, and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The dining room was vast, dominated by a long mahogany table that could seat 30. Tonight, there were only about a dozen people, older men with hard faces and expensive suits, a few wives dripping in diamonds that probably fell off the back of a truck, and a heavy, oppressive atmosphere of unspoken violence. Conversation stopped the moment Declan walked into the room with Maeve on his arm. Eyes dropped instantly to the massive emerald on her finger. A collective, silent shock rippled through the room. At the head of the table sat Patrick Walsh. He was in his late 60s, with a thick head of white hair and a face carved from granite. He looked like an old-school pugilist wearing a bespoke tuxedo. "Declan!" Patrick boomed, his voice carrying a thick Southie accent that Declan had long since polished away. "You're late, and you brought a stray." The disrespect was immediate and calculated. The room held its breath to see how Declan would react. Declan didn't flinch. He walked Maeve over to the chairs to the immediate right of the head of the table. He pulled a chair out for her. "Not a stray, Patrick," Declan said, his voice quiet but carrying effortlessly. "This is Maeve Gallagher, my fiancé, and you will address her with the respect that title demands." Patrick's eyes narrowed, his gaze locking onto Maeve. He looked her up and down, dismissing her plain black dress, her lack of flashy makeup, her tight posture. "Fiancé," Patrick scoffed, picking up his wine glass. "I heard a rumor you pulled a stunt at the Preston Gala. I thought it was just you making a point to the Blue Bloods. You're telling me you're actually marrying this accountant?" "I am," Declan said, taking his own seat next to her. Dinner was served. It was a miserable affair. The food was exquisite, but the tension was suffocating. The other captains, men introduced as Sullivan and Brendan, asked Maeve pointed, intrusive questions. They asked about her background, her lack of family connections, poking at her pedigree like vultures looking for a soft spot in a carcass. Maeve answered politely, keeping her voice level, giving them nothing but cold facts. She felt Declan watching her from the corner of his eye, a silent sentinel. Halfway through the roast lamb, Patrick leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table. "You know, Miss Gallagher," Patrick said, swirling his red wine. "In our world, we have a saying about keeping exotic birds. You can put a beautiful little canary in a solid gold cage. You can feed it the best seeds. But if that bird forgets it's in a cage, if it starts chirping too loud and drawing the attention of the neighborhood cats, the owner usually has to wring its neck to keep the peace." The table went dead silent. The wives looked down at their plates. Brendan and Sullivan smirked into their napkins. It wasn't a veiled threat. It was a promise. Patrick was telling her that she was a pet, and if she became a liability, she would be disposed of. Declan's hand tightened on his fork. The knuckles went white. He started to open his mouth, the lethal fury finally rising to the surface. Before he could speak, Maeve placed her hand gently over Declan's wrist under the table, a silent command to hold. She picked up a linen napkin, dabbed her mouth calmly, and looked directly into Patrick Walsh's hard, weathered eyes. "That's a fascinating story, Patrick," Maeve said, her voice crystal clear and entirely devoid of fear. "But I'm not much for birds. My background is in numbers and systems. In my world, we study parasites." Patrick frowned, the smirk fading. "Parasites?" "Yes," Maeve continued, leaning forward slightly, matching his aggressive posture. "Take a massive, ancient oak tree, for example. It has deep roots, strong branches. It seems invincible. But sometimes a fungus gets under the bark. It doesn't destroy the tree from the outside. It slowly siphons off the sap, draining the lifeblood of the tree from the inside out, bit by bit. It's quiet. It's greedy." She let the silence stretch for a beat, holding Patrick's gaze. She saw the exact moment the realization hit him, the faint, barely perceptible widening of his eyes. "The thing about parasites, Patrick," Maeve said softly, "is that once the tree realizes it's being bled, the cure is always the same. You don't negotiate with the rot. You take an axe, and you cut the infected branch off completely. And you burn it." The silence in the dining room was no longer just tense. It was a vacuum. No one breathed. Sullivan and Brendan stared at Maeve as if she had just pulled a live grenade out of her purse and set it on the china plates. Patrick's face turned a dangerous mottled red. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Maeve, then looked at Declan. Declan was leaning back in his chair. He had his wine glass in one hand, slowly swirling the dark liquid. He wasn't looking at Patrick. He was staring at Maeve. The look in his pale eyes was one of pure, unadulterated awe. He didn't need to say a word. Maeve had just sat at the table of the city's most dangerous men, looked the most treacherous one in the eye, and told him she knew exactly what he was doing and how it would end. Declan slowly raised his glass, holding it out toward Maeve in a silent toast. "To the cure," Declan murmured, his deep voice slicing through the absolute silence of the room. He took a sip, his eyes never leaving hers. Patrick threw his napkin onto his plate and abruptly stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He didn't say a word as he stormed out of the dining room. The rest of the dinner passed in a stunned, respectful silence. The wolves had tried to bite, and they had found steel. When they finally got back into the Maybach later that night, the partition between the front and back seats was already raised. The car pulled away from the estate, slipping into the dark, tree-lined roads. Maeve leaned her head against the cool leather window, the adrenaline crash hitting her harder than before. Her hands were shaking violently now. Suddenly, Declan's hand clamped around her wrist. He didn't pull her. He simply slid across the wide leather seat until his thigh was pressed against hers, pinning her in the corner of the car. He loomed over her, his broad chest rising and falling heavily. "Do you have any idea?" Declan growled, his face inches from hers, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "What you just did?" "I protected the asset," Maeve whispered, her breath hitching as his scent enveloped her. "I told you, I assess risk. He thought I was weak. I showed him I wasn't." "You painted a target on your back," Declan said, his eyes dropping to her lips before dragging back up to her eyes. "You practically told him you found the skin. He will come for you now. He has to." "Let him come," Maeve said, tilting her chin up. "You told me I was untouchable. Were you lying?" Declan let out a rough, ragged breath. He released her wrist, moving his hand up to cup her jaw. His long fingers tangled in the hair at the nape of her neck. The touch was possessive, fierce, and completely terrifying. "No," Declan whispered, leaning in until his lips brushed against her ear. "I wasn't lying. If he touches a single hair on your head, I will drown him in the harbor." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, the professional boundaries completely shattered in the tight confines of the car. "You're not just my accountant anymore, Maeve. You just went to war for me. And in my world, that means you belong to me." The transition from a cramped South Boston apartment to the sprawling Walsh estate was supposed to be a logistical headache. Instead, it became the bait. 3 days after the dinner with Patrick, Maeve returned to her old apartment to pack the last of her personal files. Declan had insisted on sending 2 of his men, but Maeve had brokered a compromise. They waited downstairs in the black SUV. She didn't want her neighbors, people who had known her for years, watching her get escorted out by armed guards like a cartel bride. She walked up the 3 flights of stairs, her keys jingling in her hand. The hallway smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and old carpet. It was a smell she associated with independence, with late nights studying for her CPA exams, with a life she had built entirely on her own. She unlocked her door and pushed it open. The first thing she noticed was the draft. The fire escape window was wide open, the faded curtains billowing inward. The second thing she noticed was the smell of expensive, familiar cologne beneath the scent of stale cigarette smoke. Liam was sitting at her small kitchen table. He looked terrible. The golden boy sheen had completely rubbed off. His bespoke suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, his eyes rimmed with red. He looked up as she stepped inside, a frantic, jittery energy vibrating through him. But he wasn't alone. Standing by the open window, blocking the fire escape, was a man Maeve didn't know. He was built like a cinder block, wearing a cheap leather jacket. He held a suppressed pistol, the long, ugly cylinder of the silencer, resting casually against his thigh. "Close the door, Maeve," Liam said. His voice was hoarse, lacking the polished resonance he used at his foundation galas. Maeve didn't scream. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She closed the door, letting the deadbolt click into place. She kept her purse strapped across her shoulder, her hand hovering near the panic button Declan had programmed into her phone. "Your gorillas downstairs are taking a nap in the alley," the man by the window rasped. "Don't bother with the phone." Maeve looked back at Liam. He was staring at her hands. He was staring at the emerald. "What are you doing here, Liam?" she asked, her voice deliberately flat. She didn't sound scared. She sounded like an auditor finding a clerical error. "You ruined me," Liam hissed, leaning forward. The frantic energy spiked into anger. 3 days, Maeve. It took Declan Walsh 3 days to pull the Foundation's funding. He called the mayor. He called the zoning board. My family's new development project is dead in the water. Chloe's father is threatening to call off the wedding. You completely ruined my life." "You ruined your own life," Maeve corrected softly. "I just stood there while you did it." "Shut up!" Liam slammed his fist on the table. The cheap veneer rattled. "You think you're so smart? You think you can just hook your wagon to a monster and watch me burn? Well, someone reached out to me. Someone who doesn't like the way Declan does business." Patrick Walsh, Maeve stated. The man by the window smiled, a grim, humorless stretching of the lips. The old man sends his regards. The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Patrick couldn't move on Declan directly without fracturing the entire organization. But he could take Maeve. If he held the woman Declan had publicly claimed, he held leverage. He could trade her life for the ledgers she had compiled, bury the evidence of his theft, and make Declan look weak in front of the captains. And he had used a desperate, broken Liam Preston to get past the perimeter. "Patrick promised to restore my foundation's funding," Liam babbled, scrubbing a hand over his face. "He said if I just got you to open the door, if I just kept you here until his guys arrived, he'd make everything go back to normal." Maeve looked at the man she had almost married. There was no hatred left. There was only a profound, hollow pity. "Liam," Maeve said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, chilling certainty. "Patrick Walsh is going to kill us both. Me, because I have his ledgers. You, because you are a loose end." Liam blinked, the desperate hope in his eyes fracturing. No, he said—" "He lied," she snapped. She turned her attention entirely to the man with the gun. "If you pull that trigger, or if you try to drag me out of here, Declan will dismantle you. He won't just kill you, he will take his time. You know exactly what he is." The enforcer sneered. "Declan's soft. Patrick is taking the family back to the old ways. Now drop the bag and walk toward the door. We're taking a ride to the docks." Maeve didn't move. She calculated the distance to the door, the weight of her purse, the angle of the gun. The math was terrible. There was no way out of the room. She planted her feet. No. The enforcer raised the pistol, aiming it directly at her chest. "I don't need you breathing to make the trade, lady. Patrick just needs the ring." Liam scrambled backward, his chair tipping over with a crash. "Wait! You said no one was getting hurt. You said—" "Shut up, kid!" the enforcer barked. The enforcer took a step toward Maeve, his finger tightening on the trigger. Then the apartment door exploded. It wasn't a kick. It was a breach. The heavy wood splintered inward with a deafening crack, the deadbolt tearing out of the doorframe. Before the wood even hit the floor, a shadow moved through the threshold with terrifying speed. The enforcer whipped his gun toward the doorway. 2 suppressed shots spit from the hallway. Thwip, thwip. The enforcer dropped like a stone. 2 neat holes punched through his chest. He hit the cheap linoleum floor and didn't twitch. Silence slammed back into the apartment, heavy and ringing. Declan stepped over the splintered door. He wasn't wearing his tailored suit jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up. He held a matte black handgun at his side. His face was entirely devoid of human emotion. He looked like a machine built for a single, violent purpose. Behind him, 2 more men flooded the room, instantly securing the windows and the perimeter. Declan didn't look at the dead man on the floor. He didn't look at Liam, who was backed into the corner, openly weeping with his hands over his head. Declan looked at Maeve. He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping his weapon onto the table. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his large hands gripping her tight enough to bruise. His pale eyes scanned her face, her neck, her arms, looking for blood. "Are you hit?" His voice was a harsh, ragged grate. "No," Maeve breathed, the adrenaline finally giving way to a violent tremor. She grabbed his forearms, anchoring herself to his solid weight. "I'm fine. Declan, I'm fine." He let out a breath that sounded like a curse. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her hair. He held her there for 5 long seconds. It wasn't the embrace of a client. It was a man realizing how close he had just come to losing his own pulse. When he pulled back, the raw relief vanished, replaced instantly by absolute, freezing rage. He turned his head slowly toward the corner. Liam flinched, curling into a tighter ball on the floor. "Please," Liam sobbed, a pathetic, wet sound. "Walsh, please. He made me do it. He told me he'd ruin me. I didn't know he was going to kill her. Please." Declan walked over to Liam. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't yell. He just looked down at him. "I told you I would burn your foundation to the ground," Declan said quietly. "I was wrong. That's too fast." Declan reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. He put it on speaker. "Yeah, boss," a voice answered on the first ring. "The Preston family," Declan said, his eyes never leaving Liam's terrified face. "I want the offshore accounts drained. I want the real estate holdings seized by our shell companies. I want the IRS tipped off to his father's tax evasion. And I want Chloe Danvers' family told that if they proceed with the wedding, they share the Preston debt. Consider it done. What about Patrick?" "Patrick is currently bleeding out on the floor of the harbour warehouse," Declan said coldly. "He made a play. The play failed. Burn his car, sink his boat, and clear his desk. The old regime is dead." "Understood." Declan hung up. He looked back down at Liam. "You're not going to die today, Liam," Declan said softly. "You're going to live for a very long time. You're going to wake up tomorrow with $0 in your bank account, no fiancé, no family legacy, and no future. You will spend the rest of your life working a minimum wage job, looking over your shoulder, wondering if today is the day I finally decide I'm bored of watching you suffer." Liam just cried, a broken, empty vessel of a man. Declan turned away. He picked up his gun from the table, tucked it into his waistband, and walked back to Maeve. He didn't offer his arm this time. He took her hand, lacing his fingers tightly through hers. "Let's go home," he said. They walked out of the apartment, leaving the wreckage of her past behind them. 6 weeks later, the boardroom on the top floor of Walsh Holdings smelled of lemon polish and expensive coffee. Maeve sat at the head of the long mahogany table. She wore a sharp, charcoal grey suit, her hair pulled back into a flawless twist. Spread out in front of her were the finalized contracts from the Federal Banking Commission. The transition was complete. Patrick's loyalists had been systematically removed, some bought out, others quietly disappearing into the fabric of the city. The legitimate holding company was now bulletproof. Maeve had spent 100-hour weeks cleaning the ledgers, restructuring the assets, and sealing every crack in the armor. She closed the final leather-bound folder. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Declan walked in. He looked tired, but the tension that had always tightened the corners of his eyes was gone. He owned the city completely now, and it was entirely legitimate. He walked around the table and stopped next to her chair. He didn't look at the contracts. "The board approved it," Maeve said, tapping the folder. "Walsh Holdings is officially a regulated commercial banking entity. The feds gave the green light this morning." "I know," Declan said. "Your accounts are clean. Your uncle's mess is buried. The operation is secure." Maeve kept her voice strictly professional, but her heart was beating a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was the end of the contract. The job was done. She reached for her left hand. She gripped the heavy platinum band of the emerald ring. It resisted for a second, catching on her knuckle before sliding off. The skin underneath felt strangely bare and cold. She placed the ring on top of the leather folder. The green stone caught the harsh boardroom lights. "The terms are fulfilled," Maeve said, looking up at him. She forced her voice to remain steady. "You have your clean slate, and as agreed, my new firm's lease is signed. I start taking on my own clients on Monday." Declan looked down at the ring. He didn't touch it. He braced his hands on the arms of her chair, leaning in, trapping her against the mahogany table. "You're a brilliant accountant, Maeve," Declan said, his voice dropping into that low, rumbling cadence that always made her breath catch. "But your risk assessment on this specific transaction is deeply flawed." "How so?" she whispered. "You think this was just a job?" He reached out, his calloused thumb brushing the side of her neck. tracing the line of her jaw. You think I let a woman walk into my house, look my most dangerous enemies in the eye, and protect my life, just so I could let her walk away when the paperwork was signed? Maeve looked up into those glacial eyes. They weren't cold anymore. They were burning. We had an arrangement, Declan, she said, though the conviction in her voice was crumbling rapidly. The arrangement was to keep you safe from Liam Preston, he countered. Liam Preston doesn't exist anymore. He's working the night shift at a toll booth in Jersey. The threat is neutralized. The contract is void. He picked up the ring from the folder. He didn't ask. He took her left hand, holding her fingers firmly in his grip. I don't want an arrangement anymore, Declan said fiercely. I don't want a consultant. I want my partner. I want the woman who didn't flinch when the guns were drawn. I want you, Maeve, for real, to the bone. No half measures. He didn't wait for her to answer. He slid the heavy emerald back onto her ring finger, pushing it securely into place. Maeve looked at the ring, then up at the man who had torn her world apart just to build her a new one. She remembered the humiliation in the ballroom, the cold certainty of his voice when he claimed her, and the absolute violence he unleashed to protect her. He was a monster to the rest of the world, but to her, he was the only solid ground she had ever stood on. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she reached up, her fingers tangling in the collar of his shirt, and pulled him down to her. When he kissed her, it wasn't polite, and it wasn't a performance. It was a claim. It was possessive, desperate, and terrifyingly real. Maeve kissed him back with equal ferocity, matching his heat, accepting the terms of this new, permanent contract. They broke apart, both of them breathing heavily. Declan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. So, Declan murmured, a dark smile finally breaking across his face. Are you going to marry me? Or do I need to find another charity gala to crash? Maeve laughed, a genuine breathless sound that echoed in the quiet boardroom. She looked down at this emerald, bright and heavy on her hand. You crash my schedule again, Mr. Walsh, Maeve said, straightening his tie with a smirk. And I'll audit you for real, Declan chuckled, pulling her out of the chair and back against his chest. I'm counting on it, Mrs. Walsh. When the dust settles, the real power isn't in who holds the gun, it's in who holds the ledgers. Maeve didn't just survive the mob. She became its queen, proving that the best revenge is simply outsmarting the people who tried to break you. What did you think of Maeve's brutal takedown of Liam and Patrick? Would you have handed the ring back, or kept the empire? Let me know in the comments below.